Angelika Kluk was a bright, kind-hearted student from Poland. Peter Tobin was a drifter hiding a monstrous past. When their lives crossed inside the quiet walls of a Glasgow church, it sparked one of the most chilling murder cases in British history, one that would uncover not just a brutal killing, but the terrifying secrets of a serial predator hiding in plain sight. On a calm Sunday in early September, in the city of Glasgow, Scotland, the congregation at St. Vincent's Church was going about their day as usual. The church, with its towering stained glass windows and quiet air of tradition, had always been a place of peace. Among the people working there was 23-year-old Angelika Kluk, a university student from Poland who had come to Scotland for the summer. She had been staying in the church's residence, helping with cleaning, translating, and other day-to-day tasks. Angelika was known for being hard-working, polite, and deeply religious. She attended Mass regularly, formed friendships with members of the church, and seemed to fit in easily despite being far from home. On that particular Sunday, Angelika was seen by several people attending morning service. She wore a simple black outfit, carried a small handbag, and greeted people with her usual warm expression. No one suspected anything out of the ordinary. As the hours passed, the day grew quieter, and church staff assumed Angelika had gone out, for a walk or perhaps to run errands. But as evening arrived and she didn't return, concern began to grow. Her room remained untouched. Her bed was still made. Her wallet, passport, and mobile phone were found sitting where she had left them. That detail was the first real sign that something was wrong. Angelika had vanished, and she hadn't taken anything with her. When she didn't return by the next morning, a missing person report was filed. Police began by asking questions around the church. They interviewed priests, volunteers, and residents. No one had seen her leave. Security at the church was minimal. There were no cameras installed inside, and the area was usually unlocked during the day. The community, stunned and confused, came together to help search. Flyers were printed, posters were stapled to lampposts, and vigils were quietly held in hope she would return safely. As the days passed, worry turned into dread. Search dogs were brought in to comb the nearby gardens, parks, and walkways. Boats scanned the River Clyde. There was no trace, no clothing, no signs of a struggle, nothing left behind. It was as though she had simply disappeared. Police began to consider every possibility. Had she left willingly? Was she kidnapped? Could she have had a secret life no one knew about? But nothing pointed to that. Her family back in Poland was adamant that she would never disappear without contacting them. Her professors, friends, and the priests who knew her all said the same thing. She was responsible, careful, and kind. Days turned into nights. Investigators returned to the church again and again, walking its grounds, checking for any clue that may have been missed. It was then that one officer, unfamiliar with the building, paused near a locked storeroom behind the altar. A faint odor lingered in the air, damp wood, but something else too, something far worse. They marked it for further inspection. The mystery was beginning to unravel, but what they would find next would shock the entire nation. The storeroom behind the altar at St. Vincent's Church had long been forgotten by most who worked there. Used mostly for storing old furniture, broken tools, and discarded decorations, it was rarely entered, and the door remained locked. But after Angelika Kluk's disappearance, every corner of the church had to be re-examined. The faint sour smell coming from that small room had caught the attention of a detective during a routine search. It wasn't overpowering, but it was enough to raise suspicion. With a search warrant in hand, investigators returned to the church on the fourth day of Angelika's disappearance, determined to uncover anything they might have overlooked. When they opened the storeroom door, the interior was dark, cluttered, and musty. Dust floated in the air as beams of light from flashlights scanned the floor. The wooden boards were uneven in places, and there were fresh scratches near the baseboards, as though something heavy had been dragged across them. A few of the boards looked recently disturbed. Tools were brought in to remove the floor section by section. As the boards were pried up, officers uncovered a layer of old carpeting and trash. Then came a roll of tarp, stained and heavy, hidden beneath debris. It was carefully unwrapped. Inside was the lifeless body of Angelika Kluk. The air in the room turned still. Officers paused in disbelief and horror. Angelika had been concealed beneath the floor, her body wrapped and weighted down. The tarp had been used to hide bloodstains and prevent the smell from spreading too quickly. But it hadn't worked. The room, sealed and forgotten, had become a temporary tomb. Forensic investigators were immediately called in, and the church was sealed off. Inside the cramped space, they found evidence of a violent struggle. Blood had soaked through the tarp in places and stained the underside of the floorboards. There were bruises on Angelika's arms, consistent with restraint, and markings around her neck and head suggested she had suffered blunt force trauma. The official cause of death would later reveal she was still alive when she was hidden, left to die slowly in the darkness beneath the floor. News of the discovery spread rapidly, first through the church staff, then across Glasgow, and eventually nationwide. Shock and sorrow filled the community. A church, a place believed to offer sanctuary, had become the scene of a gruesome murder. The clergy were devastated. No one could explain how this had happened under their roof, or how a killer had come and gone without anyone noticing. The investigation shifted focus immediately. This was no longer a missing persons case. It was now a homicide. Every person connected to the church was re-interviewed. Records were reviewed, fingerprints taken, and surveillance footage from nearby shops and streets was collected. Among the many questions investigators now faced, one stood out. Who had the opportunity and the knowledge to place Angelika in such a hidden, obscure part of the church without being seen? The answer would come from a name no one at the church truly knew. As police began to re-examine everyone associated with St. Vincent's Church, one name stood out: Pat McLaughlin. He had been introduced to the clergy as a friendly drifter, someone who had needed a place to stay and had offered to help out. Around the church in return, he fixed broken locks, cleaned storage rooms, and often worked alone. The priests, trusting and welcoming, allowed him to sleep in a small room on the church grounds. He never asked for much and didn't seem to bother anyone. Most described him as quiet, polite, and somewhat forgettable, but that forgettable presence had suddenly become suspicious. Investigators tried to find a record of Pat McLaughlin, any identification, past address, employment history, but came up with nothing. The name didn't exist. There was no driver's license, no birth certificate, no social security number. A deeper background check led to a dead end. Whoever this man was, he had created a false identity and had been living it comfortably within the walls of the church. An older priest recalled that Pat had once mentioned growing up in England and having a difficult life, but there were no details. Another staff member remembered that he kept a small backpack with him at all times and became visibly uncomfortable when someone came too close to his personal belongings. His room was sparse, just a mattress, a blanket, and a few items of clothing. But there was something else. A screwdriver had been left near his bed, stained with what looked like dried blood. DNA tests on the screwdriver would later confirm the worst. It matched Angelika's blood. That discovery sent shockwaves through the investigation. Whoever Pat really was, he had likely murdered Angelika, hidden her beneath the floor, and then vanished. He had been living at the church during the same time she disappeared and fled shortly after. But no one had reported seeing him leave. He was simply gone. With no clear identity to work from, investigators sent fingerprints and DNA samples from the screwdriver and other items to the national database. The match came back quickly, and it was chilling. Pat McLaughlin was actually Peter Tobin, a convicted sex offender with a long and violent history. Tobin had previously served time for drugging and assaulting 2 teenage girls in England. He had changed his name after being released and had been evading authorities ever since. This wasn't just a case of mistaken identity. This was a deliberate act of hiding in plain sight. Tobin had inserted himself into a community that welcomed outsiders, gaining trust, access, and privacy. He had positioned himself perfectly to find his next victim. Angelika had likely trusted him, just as others had. She had probably never imagined that the man fixing a broken light bulb or sweeping the church floor was a predator in disguise. The discovery of Tobin's true identity turned the case from horrifying to monstrous. He was now the most wanted man in Scotland, and authorities feared Angelika might not be his only victim. With Peter Tobin's true identity exposed, police wasted no time launching a nationwide manhunt. His face was broadcast across every news channel in the United Kingdom. Posters were pinned up at bus stops, train stations, and public buildings. His mugshot, cold eyes, a hardened face, was impossible to ignore. The public was warned that Tobin was dangerous and unpredictable. He had already slipped away once, and investigators feared he could do it again. Authorities traced his last known movements, starting with his sudden disappearance from the church. Witnesses believed he had left sometime in the evening, shortly after Angelika vanished. A nearby CCTV camera caught a glimpse of him at a corner shop, buying food and a train ticket with cash. It was a small lead, but enough to determine his direction. He had boarded a train heading south, possibly toward London. After that, the trail grew cold. Tobin was clever. He used different aliases in each city, stayed in hostels under fake names, and paid only in cash. He avoided security, cameras, and stayed off the grid. Weeks passed and frustration mounted. Still, police kept digging, analyzing phone records, bank statements, and any contact Tobin might have made before vanishing. They found nothing, until a hospital in London contacted them with a tip. A man matching Tobin's description had been admitted under the name James Kelly, complaining of chest pains. Staff grew suspicious when he refused to provide proper identification. One nurse recognized his face from the news and alerted authorities. Within hours, officers surrounded the hospital and arrested Tobin as he tried to leave. He didn't resist. In fact, he said very little at all, but it was clear from his expression he knew the game was over. With Tobin in custody, investigators began to build their case. Forensics had already connected him to Angelika's murder through DNA, fingerprints, and the weapon found in his room. There was no question about his guilt, but detectives weren't satisfied with just one conviction. They believed Tobin's crimes went far deeper. Detectives reviewed cold cases across the country, especially those involving young women who had disappeared without explanation. Patterns began to emerge. Similar methods, similar victim profiles. The possibility that Tobin had killed before, perhaps multiple times, suddenly became very real. Search teams were dispatched to his former homes, including one in Margate, Kent. The property had once been owned by Tobin and rented out under one of his aliases. In the garden, police found signs of disturbed soil. Cadaver dogs reacted immediately. A dig was ordered. What they found buried beneath the patio stunned everyone. 2 bodies, both teenage girls who had been missing for years. The remains were badly decomposed, but enough evidence remained to confirm their identities. Tobin had buried them in his backyard and moved on as if nothing had happened. The scale of Tobin's crimes was beginning to reveal itself. Angelika's death, while horrific on its own, was just one chapter in a much longer story. Investigators now believed they had uncovered the actions of a serial killer who had been hiding in plain sight for decades. With Peter Tobin behind bars, the investigation turned from pursuit to revelation. Angelika Kluk's murder had opened a door into a dark and far-reaching pattern of violence. As detectives combed through years of missing persons cases, they noticed disturbing similarities that linked Tobin to other disappearances. He had used a variety of names over the years, always moving from town to town, often inserting himself into trusted spaces, churches, shelters, and boarding houses. He stayed just long enough to gain access to women and girls who were vulnerable, then vanished before suspicion caught up with him. The discovery of 2 bodies in the garden of his former home in Kent confirmed their fears. The remains were identified as Vicky Hamilton and Dinah McNichol, both teenagers who had gone missing in 1991. At the time, no one had made a connection between their cases. They had disappeared in different towns under different circumstances, but Tobin had lived in both places. He had buried one girl in the garden and kept the other in the same grave, separated only by a layer of concrete. The cruelty was calculated. He had hidden them in plain sight and continued on with his life for over a decade. These discoveries sent a wave of shock through the country. Families of other missing women began contacting police, desperate to know if their daughters could also be connected. The police established a special task force to investigate Tobin's past movements. They tracked his employment history, bank records, and housing contracts. In nearly every location he had stayed, a woman or girl had gone missing, been attacked, or later turned up dead. Despite the growing list of possible victims, Tobin refused to cooperate. He showed no remorse, no interest in assisting investigators. When he did speak, it was often cryptic or dismissive. He denied involvement in some cases, admitted to others, and played a constant game of misdirection. It became clear that he enjoyed the control, even from a prison cell. For the families of the victims, this added a layer of pain that could not be undone. Tobin was eventually convicted for the murder of Angelika Kluk and sentenced to life in prison, with no chance of release. But for law enforcement, it was only the beginning. His case prompted sweeping changes in how offenders were tracked, particularly those with a history of violent or sexual crimes. Authorities acknowledged the failure to monitor him after his early release from prison years before, a mistake that had cost multiple lives. To this day, no one knows exactly how many victims Peter Tobin left behind. Some believe there are more bodies buried in forgotten places, more families waiting for answers they may never receive. Angelika's murder was the tragedy that brought his crimes into the light, but it also became a symbol of the hidden danger that can lurk behind ordinary faces. Her story, once just one of heartbreak, now stands as a reminder. Evil can wear 1,000 disguises, and sometimes it hides in the last place we expect.